It's that time of year again. Looks like there's a new Angular release, and this one's actually really exciting. Not just because the React and Angular versions are finally synchronized at 19, but because they're actually seeming to pay more attention to both what we're doing in other frameworks, as well as what the Angular community itself is looking for. Historically, Angular has not been that, I don't want to say reactive because that has other implications, but not as responsive to what's going on both inside and outside. I've personally been horrified seeing some of the really talented engineers in that ecosystem whose work was getting ignored. But that really seems to have changed. The Angular 19 release is genuinely pretty exciting, and I can't wait to tell you all about it. But first, a quick word from today's sponsor. Today's sponsor is Browserbase. They're making a new browser. It's not one for you or me, it's for AI and our code. We've all had to deal with Playwright or Puppeteer in the past. It's no fun. Imagine if it was as easy as Command Enter. It actually is. You run the hotkey, it loads, and now you can go across the entire web, not by writing really complex code, but by prompting. I can tell it, go to Hacker News, click on the first search result, or any basic English query like that, and it does the right thing. But it's not just for doing weird things in the browser like this, it's also fully programmatic, so you can call your own code in your code base to trigger these things as well. Great for us serverless devs who are tired of trying to spin up Puppeteer inside of a Lambda and hitting limits on the size of the folders. I've been there, I'm sure we all have at some point. In my opinion, that's cool enough, but where they go way further is the new open source project they just dropped, Stagehand. Stagehand lets you write prompts to do what you used to with Playwright. Yes, you don't have to write all the crazy selectors anymore. It's a web browsing framework focused on simplicity and extensibility, and honestly, I could already see myself using this for our end-to-end testing. You literally write English instructions for what you want it to do and give it a Zod schema to validate the data it gives back. So you go to a website, in this case, we go to the Browserbase Stagehand GitHub repo. We tell it to click the contributors. You don't tell it which element, you just give it the action in English and it figures it out. Then you tell it in the instruction to extract the top contributor and it should give it to you in this schema format. What? Just for comparison's sake, here is what you'd have to write before even using something really nice like Playwright to do it. You would still have to evaluate the page, select all of the elements by hand, create an array out of it, increment through all of them, keeping track of what their values are, selecting these weird sub-elements with ULs and LIs and all that chaos. Now you can literally just write an English instruction and it does the right thing. Automating browsers should never have been so hard. Browserbase makes it almost too easy. Check them out today at soydev.link/browserbase. Let's dive in. The first thing that threw me, if you didn't know, the creator of Angular, specifically AngularJS, was Miško, M-I-S-K-O, who's also the creator of Qwik, Q-W-I-K, the framework. So seeing Minkko writing this and not Miško threw me for a second, but unnecessary tangent, let's dive in, because they are doing some huge things. In the past 2 years, we doubled down on our investment in dev experience and performance, which is fun because these are the two things I would argue Angular was lacking the most, and they're really focused on fixing that finally. Believe it or not, there was a point in time where Angular was kind of leading the industry in DX. They were the first framework to go all in on TypeScript, even though Angular was a Google framework and TypeScript was a Microsoft project. I could even make the argument we might never have seen the success TypeScript has today if it wasn't for Angular. And it hurts me to say that, but it's true. In every single release, we've been consistently shipping improvements that multiply their impact when combined together. Seeing the positive community response and increased engagement in our developer events is validating that we've been moving in the right direction. Today's release is bringing a series of improvements that will make it even easier for you to deliver fast web apps with confidence. This is interesting because I am suspicious of the number of new Angular apps being created compared to other tools and technologies, but the value of Angular is that code bases from 10 years ago suck the exact same amount today as they sucked 10 years ago, which is great. Where there's a lot of React code bases that have had new things added layer upon layer that now suck worse than they used to. Angular, to its benefit and detriment, has historically moved slow enough to not end up with that rift of quality of experience across the code base, which has benefits and negatives. Thankfully, they are focused on making sure the whole Angular community gets to come along for the ride to these improvements, which is huge. And it's not just interop, it's a lot of code mod type stuff. We'll get to that and we'll compare it to how React handled things with hooks in just a minute. First, the highlights. They introduced a developer preview of incremental hydration supporting the most performance-demanding use cases. Incremental hydration is going to be real fun. The fact that Angular knows what a server is and that HTML is a thing is a huge change that they've been working towards that we're finally seeing the light at the end of the tunnel for. They added control for which routes render on client, server, or during build, and the ability to resolve route parameters during those pre-rendering steps. We don't even really have this in Next.js right now, so that's going to be fun to read. They have new schematics to keep you up to date with the latest best practices. I don't want to talk about dependency injection, especially if you put the word inject in the front, but the new build system stuff's going to be real cool. Stabilization of core reactivity primitives and the introduction of some new ones like linked signal and resource. This is huge, by the way. Angular went all in on signals. They almost built solid into the framework in a lot of ways, and it's allowed for a lot of meaningful improvements to performance, as well as the way that you can get this on your code base, which we'll get to in a bit. Probably my favorite call on this list, though, they're actually going through feature requests on GitHub. They set a weird bar of 2,700 thumbs up, which means there was one thing with 2,500 thumbs up they didn't want to do. That's why they drew the line there. That's always how it goes. But I get it. They wanted to use the community signals to figure out what people do and don't actually care about, which is great. Now they have a time picker component, unused import auto removal, running schematics via the language server, and a bunch of other cool things. Ooh, HMR for styles is huge. I can't believe they didn't have that. What that means is if I have my page open and I have my editor open next to it and I change something that isn't a style, it would update the page without me refreshing. But if I wanted to screw around with the styles, like I'm playing with the border color of a chat box and I save a CSS change, I wouldn't see it in the browser until I refresh. HMR for styles is huge. It's actually I would argue one of the best use cases for hot module replacement, because if I get my page into a state and it doesn't look how I want it to, I want to be able to change the styles without losing that state. And that wasn't popular in Angular before. To their credit, this only got added to Remix like a year ago. It was one of my biggest issues with it. So it's not like everyone has this, but it's cool seeing them catch up to these, what I would call modern tools, standards, and expectations. Evolving Angular, we see the opportunity to enable best performance practices out of the box so that we can support your performance-sensitive use cases. In the past 2 years, we kicked off a project to enable Zoneless Angular, made server-side rendering an integral part of the Angular CLI, and we worked closely with Chrome Aurora on hydration and the image directives. Aurora is the collab between frameworks and Chrome. It's the reason that Next is finally getting some nice things with pre-rendering and prefetching and images and all that, added in on all sides. It's been a nice change, and Aurora is the name for this collab. Weird that I haven't heard other frameworks calling it by that name, just saying they're collaborations with Chrome, but it makes sense. They're the Google framework. They're going to use all the proper nouns for everything. Version 19, we're elevating Angular server-side rendering to another level with incremental hydration, server route configuration, event replay enabled by default, and more. These are huge changes. Angular up until recently had no concept of server rendering. Almost all of it was coming from Brandon Roberts with Analog.js, which was his attempt at making a Next.js equivalent for Angular. Before Angular even had proper SSR support, he hacked all of it in himself. Now more and more of these parts are ending up in Angular itself. I wish I'd give him more credit for the work he did and pull him in more often, but at the very least, the progress is finally happening. Is it too little, too late? That's not for me to decide. I'm just happy it's here. The event replay is a big one. If you're not already familiar with what hydration is, it means that you run JavaScript code on the server to generate a page. The user gets that page, but then none of the JavaScript is there yet. So if I have a button with an on click and I click it, but the JS hasn't loaded yet, nothing happens until the JS loads and hydrates, which means it binds all the right JS to the right places on the page. So what event replay does is it allows me to, when I click a button and the JS isn't there yet, the HTML has inlined some JS that caches and puts all of the things you do on a queue. So when the JS finally all loads in, at that point, it can just execute everything in the queue. So if you click a button, you have to wait a second for all the JS to load and bind and everything, but the event doesn't get lost. It just gets buffered, waiting for the JS that can actually process it. This is the case in most server-side rendered frameworks, which is why hydration isn't a big problem. Sorry, Mishko, we just disagree on this one. This is the right fix for most of the time. To be fair, that means you'll click a button and nothing will happen until everything else loads in. And with Angular, some of those payloads and some of those JS files are massive, but you're not losing events. And once that JS loads, it's all cached and you have no problems at all going forward. So it's a nice thing, especially when you combine it with incremental hydration, which means different parts of the page can be hydrated in different orders depending on what's the most important thing. Like if I go to the Amazon page for a random item, the add to cart button probably needs to work way faster than anything else on the page, or the buy it now button, versus the leave a review button probably doesn't need to be filled in quite as early. So if you can choose which things become active and have their behaviors bound first versus what does later, that can save you a lot of that giant JS chunk to make sure the right parts are responsive quicker. But none of this matters if once the JS is loaded, things are still slow. And they've done some really cool things for that too, which I'm sure we'll get to soon, if not immediately after. Building large web apps increases the amount of JavaScript that we ship to the user. Do you know what else does that? Begins with an A and ends in Angular. Anyways, it does negatively impact the user experience to have too much JS. I think we all hopefully agree on this at this point. If not, I don't know how I can help you. In version 17, we made it trivial to lazily load code using deferrable views for client-side rendered apps. For server-side rendered apps, we introduced full app hydration, which requires all of the JS associated with a given page to make it interactive. So what this means is if you had an element that required a ton of JS, you could lazily load that JS in later, so everything else for the page is there immediately. But as soon as you introduce SSR, you have to load all the JS. Now, you can use deferrable views to say, no, don't load the JS for this part. Don't render that part yet. Let the client deal with it when it gets there. I don't want to block on this, which is a nice change. The way to do this in React and Next.js is you use their Next dynamic wrapper and pass SSR:false in order to do this type of behavior. Cool to see it built into Angular directly. Welcome incremental hydration in developer preview. Okay, so it's still in dev preview. It's still very new. What it allows you to do is use their @defer directive. Love or hate directives. They are what they are. Wow, that looks familiar. Okay, I actually genuinely love that Angular is cloning Next.js demos. That is such a good sign that they're paying attention to what is or isn't working. I don't care how fucking into Angular you are. Next.js, React, and all the things in that ecosystem are innovating much faster and bringing us much closer to a better and faster web. If you're not able to acknowledge that, you're holding back the web. Angular not only acknowledging this, but fully embracing it, using the terminology that was invented on that side of the fucking forest and bringing it over here is huge. And the reason I'm going on this tangent is that this demo I just watched, it looks very familiar. Here is the Next.js commerce template. Pretty funny. I love that though. I like that they're actually paying attention to what's going on in the ecosystem and making something that looks so hilariously similar, because all of our goals should be the same. We should be trying to improve the tools and technologies we use to make the web and the experience we have building for the web better. And they're no longer living in their own bubble. My concern here is I don't know how many of the Angular devs are actually going to like this, because I know a lot of people who picked Angular because it didn't change. And now that Angular is actually changing and improving, those people might get upset. And if you were around long enough to know the red wedding, which was AngularJS v1 to Angular v2, which the dropping of JS because they moved to TypeScript, that shift was so big that it makes a lot of devs who were around then hesitant to any major update ever. They just assume it's going to break everything because AngularJS to Angular was a rewrite of your code base, period. Chat's saying they all love this, but to be clear, if you're an Angular dev and you watch my live streams, hell, if you're an Angular dev and you watch my YouTube videos, you're probably not the person I'm worried about here because you're already paying attention. Like you use Next.js for fun on the side. You're not the average Angular dev. You get the point. I hope they're able to get the whole community excited and to move along with them because I hate seeing people stuck in the past because they're scared of change. And if they can ease these devs into the change, that'll be a huge, huge win. And to their credit, React kind of failed with this with server components. The strategy to make the average React dev respect server components is for the React team to help me and people like me communicate about them better. I hope it wins. I like to think that strategy is good, but it's a complex and different enough way of thinking. And React devs have spent so much time on the client and so little time on the server that they struggle with the new mental model. I don't know if the average Angular dev has changed their mental model for 5 years. So I'm curious to see if and how they pull this off. And if they do, I hope I can learn a bunch from it too, as I try to get people onto the train leading to the future. So let's actually pay attention to this demo. Okay, so he clicked, and then it hydrated that part. Interesting. And when he clicked there was a loading spinner there, or a loading state. And that loading state wasn't because we were waiting for the server to respond with the new page. It was because the JS had to load, hydrate that spot, and then get interactive. This is actually a really good thing. If they can get this working for giant Angular code bases, it'll make the perceived responsiveness of these old Angular apps that are huge much better. There's a bit of backstory here where Angular and Wiz, which are the two Google frameworks, one is the popular public one, Angular, one's the nobody knows about it private one, Wiz. Wiz is super fast and performant, and its DX is absolute garbage. Internally, they've been trying to fuse together Angular and Wiz and merge them into one framework with the best of both. But I have concerns. Specifically, you're probably watching me on YouTube right now. YouTube was written in Wiz. This means they're going to be porting YouTube to Angular. If they can get all this stuff in first, YouTube will be slightly faster. If they can't, or they have to turn off any of these features, YouTube is going to get way slower. So I hope, for my own livelihood, they pull this off, because whether or not I use Angular, it's probably going to be the single framework most responsible for my income in the near future. So we're rooting for them. So here's how they describe what's going on here. A component in grayscale filter shows Angular hasn't loaded and hydrated yet. Angular downloads a component from the network when the component starts pulsing. Angular has downloaded and hydrated the component when there's a purple border around it and the component no longer has a grayscale filter. Okay, so all of the grayscale isn't just them doing the Vercel theming. It's them showing the thing hasn't hydrated yet. That makes sense. Yeah, once you've clicked here, now this whole thing has been hydrated. And now if you click other things there, it'll be way faster. Okay, this is making sense. It's funny because this is like what Mishko was trying to do with Quick, and he's going to be so mad if Angular beats him to it. Oh. The demo also has an artificial delay of 500 milliseconds for each loading operation. So that's why it seems slow with those things coming in. They did that to make the demo good. If you had a shitload of JavaScript and you were on a slow internet connection, it could actually take that long. Here's a cool point, though. Notice that at the beginning, everything beside the top bar is grayed out. This means that at this point, we have not downloaded any of the JS associated with the page. When the user engages with the filter component at the top left, Angular downloads it, which they indicated by pulsing, and after that, it hydrates it. So by default, Angular isn't loading JS until you start doing things. Then the JS comes in. There's a lot of benefits and a lot of negatives to this approach. I think it's pretty hype. The potential here is huge. I am assuming that it will start to prefetch things in the background if you're not doing anything, and it will optimize for the ones you're clicking on and not just rely on these actions, because if it only downloads the JS when you interact, everything's going to feel slower until everything's been downloaded. But they're going to find the balance here. There's a reason it's a preview feature. That said, it's really fucking cool, and it'd be cool to see this in React. Wait. Oh no. I just said it would be cool if React gets something that Angular has first. I'm going to have an existential crisis. That's a first and then some. Even without the artificial delay, Angular now will download and hydrate the components asynchronously, which means that we have to replay the user events. For this functionality, we're using the event replay that was introduced in Angular version 18, which powers Google Search. Google Search is powered by Angular now? It's a funny tweet that immediately came to mind when I learned that Angular is being used on Google.com. On Google's own Core Vitals scores, Google.com fails, which is pretty funny because these are the scores Google uses to pick what things it should or shouldn't index as strongly, and it fails its own test, which is really funny. And the fact that INP is as low as it is, that it takes 250 milliseconds from when you click something to when you get to the next part, if they're waiting for the JS to load from when I click to when I see the result, this might actually be the reason that score was that low. Like, as hilarious as it is, it might actually be Angular introducing event replay on Google.com that pushed back this number like that. That's kind of funny. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying it's interesting. That's all. Of course, Multiflex showing that all of Vercel stuff passes. Oh, Next Faster does pass. Didn't know that. That's cool. Yeah, this is a funny call out because Levels had said every website fails Google's Core Web Vitals. Not every website. I'd argue most Vercel websites probably don't. But yeah, it is what it is. Worth considering. Also on the same topic, pagespeed.web.dev, which is the thing we're running the test on, scores terribly on page speed. There is also the call out on Levels.io thing where he thinks it's impossible for anyone to get this because the way he builds, it's really hard to get these scores. But you can also game them and get good ones. I thought Malta had responded here. I can't find it, but I know a lot of other engineers showed how you can get the good scores, but also that sites that fly, like Next Faster, which I did a whole video on how insanely fast the site is. This site scores poorly on that because it measures weird shit. I really think that the page speeds insights needs to be overhauled to be a little more modern. When you update to Angular 19, you can try the new incremental hydration in any application that already uses SSR and has full application hydration. In your client Bootstrap, you specify the following. You add the with incremental hydration to provide client hydration. Cool. You can even apply it to portions of your template with @defer I hate the syntax so much. We're going to ignore the syntax because there's cool things here. If I just don't, if I pretend this isn't Angular, I can learn a lot of cool things here. But if I had to pick between page speeds being modernized and Angular being modernized, I hate I'm saying it, but I would pick Angular. Here we are. They have the whole section here on event replay. I mentioned how this works. They have their event dispatch library. Oh, are they not using Angular itself? They're just using the event dispatcher because it's a separate library. That's kind of cool. And as I mentioned before, this is part of the convergence of Angular and Wiz, which is why these things are happening and being broken out this way. This is exactly what I said before, where the page starts listening for all JS events, stores them, and then once everything else loads, the event dispatcher can trigger those JS events. It's cool stuff, worth a dig if you're curious about it. I don't think I could possibly make a video about that people care about. Are they even using Excalidraw for demos now? Are they watching me? I should have worn my Angular shirt for this. Fuck. For what it's worth, the Angular team's actually been really nice for me to chat with and work with. They've been super friendly and kind and good. God, am I becoming... No, I need to stop. I'm not going to become an Angular person. I'm not going to do it. Oh, wait, no. We know this is an Angular because they use capital letters for the components. It is actually cool seeing them use Excalidraw and things like that for this, though. I love this. Ooh. They made event replay the default. That's actually huge. So this will just work for everybody because I'll be real, most Angular devs aren't turning on experimental features. They're Angular devs for a reason. These things becoming the default's actually going to improve the quality of experience on the web. Like Cisco's Web Connect and their whole fucking like whatever it's called, their Zoom equivalent just got so much better once they update to Angular 19 in 2 years. I'm curious about this route level render mode. Oh, I get this. Since in Angular, you configure your routes instead of it all being path-based. I like route config. I like this. I wish I could do this in Next for a lot of reasons. The fact that you can specify how it should render. You can say this should be server rendered, this should be client rendered, and this should be pre-rendered. So we render it on the server and then the client takes over from there. That's cool that you can configure that. I actually really like that. In Next.js, you have to export magic variables for their equivalent, which is not fun. They're slowly moving away from that with partial pre-rendering and dynamic I/O. But since Angular is never going to do magic right, I like that they gave me the config here. This is good. I like this a lot. I'm not going to say I want this in React again. It's just going to hurt me if I do. We're going to get this in TanStack, to be fair. So TanStack Start's going to be real similar. Oh God, is TanStack Start the Angular of React? I don't want to think too hard about that thought. In the past, there was no ergonomic way to resolve route parameters at pre-render time, which means like if you have an ID in the URL or you have a query param, the end of the URL, those types of things, you couldn't get them when you did pre-rendering. Not that you can, and it's funny, you could actually do this relatively easily with Page Router with Next.js, but App Router does not make it friendly at all. It's nice that you can just specify, I want these IDs, I'm going to grab them, and then I'm going to return a map of them, because now it's going to go through all the values here and generate HTML for them during build, so when a user goes to the page, it's already been generated. Nice. Quality change. Server-side rendering with zoneless Angular. Zone.js has historically been a critical component in Angular's SSR, notifying the serving stack when the framework has completed rendering and all of the markup on the page is ready. We identified the main reason to wait for apps are pending requests in navigation. We introduce a primitive that we use in Angular with HTTP client as well as the router, which delays sending the page to users until the app is ready. That means you don't need Zone.js, which is the thing that kept track of all that in the past. I'm not familiar with how much people would be upset with Zone.js and why they care so much, but if they put it this high up, it's got to be a big deal. It is cool that RxJS, which might not be popular outside of Angular anymore, still very much part of their world, that you can pipe the event for when the page is actually done hydrating so you can trigger things at that point. Very nice. When the subscription emits a new value, we'll make the app stable and the serving stack will pass the rendered markup to the client. Interesting. Anyways, let's dive into DX because I've been making jokes about it the whole time. I want to hear the actual changes. Instant edit and refresh with HMR. That's huge. You save and you see the change. Angular 19 supports HMR for styles out of the box, and they enable experimental support for templating HMR as well. Oh, they had no HMR before. Styles is just the only thing it supports by default. Interesting. As a React dev that's been building things in other tools, especially like I've been building a game in Phaser.js, I didn't realize how used to saving, checking browser, saving, checking browser I was. The fact that I have to refresh and build systems to get back to the state I care about is very strange. And I'm still struggling with the mental adjustment to that. The fact that Angular didn't have it is terrifying, but they're finally taking it seriously because they actually care about DX now. Yeah, look at that. You save a style, and as soon as you save it, you see the difference. You don't have to refresh it or lose the state. If you have a counter or like a chat widget, it holds it in the right spot. Yeah. We introduced standalone components over 2 years ago in V14. Wait, there's been 5 majors in 2 years for Angular? The fuck? We've had 1 major in 3 years for React. Latest developer survey, over 90% of devs said they're using this feature. As part of V19, we're providing a schematic that will run as part of the ng update, and it will automatically remove the standalone component metadata property for all your standalone directives, components, and pipes, set standalone to false for non-standalone abstractions. Yeah, it turns out isolated components are a good thing. Who would have thought? Oh, that's the thing I hadn't even thought of. HMR looks great. Might stop editing styles in DevTools. I forgot people do that. I don't change styles in Chrome. I change them in my editor and look at them in Chrome because it's faster to do it that way. The fact that people still rely on Chrome DevTools for testing styles is insane to me. And it shows just how bad the DX was at the time. I am so thankful we don't need to do that anymore. Oh, they even added a compiler check to say all components have to be standalone because historically components were not as fully encapsulated and the relationship between them was complex. People don't want to build that way anymore, so they let you emphasize and specify and compiler check that you're not building with the weird bridging between elements anymore. That's a huge change. Turns out, again, isolated components are a good thing. State of testing tooling, I don't care. Secure from the start, I kind of care. Oh, there was some weird strict content things. I did an Angular project for a demo at Render ATL this year, where I ran an Angular project inside of a Next project for a demo. The amount of weird meta tag shit Angular does by default around like base URLs and stuff is terrifying. Curious what they changed here. They automatically will generate a hash-based strict content security policy based on the scripts in your index HTML. The browser will add the hash of every inline script to the CSP. Each script will have a unique hash associated with it. That will prevent an attacker from running a malicious script on your page because for the browser to execute the script, its hash needs to be present in that CSP. That's cool. It's more bloat in the Angular like metadata field, but nice they're doing those things. Ooh, this might break Chrome extensions actually. Fuck. Interesting. Evolving reactivity. Here's where we get to the real fun signal stuff I was hinting at before. The stuff that makes Angular go from the slowest framework to one of the fastest in one feature add. A core theme for Angular over the past 2 years has been evolving our reactivity system. In V19, we're excited to share a couple new complementary APIs, as well as the stabilization of some of the fundamental reactivity APIs that we introduced in the previous versions, such as input, output, and view queries. I hate these names, but we'll see what they do. This is where things start to get real fun. The stabilization of these new signal-based APIs. So inputs and outputs and view queries are how a lot of the data management goes in existing Angular apps. They've been moving these APIs over to use signals so they can be much more granular with their updates. Now that they've stabilized the APIs and they've finished the signals part, you can run these generate commands that will update all of the usage you have of the standard inputs, queries, and outputs APIs to make them use the new signal-based APIs instead, which should be a one run and now your app is faster. There are catches. They call out that since signal inputs are read-only in contrast to traditional inputs, you might need to migrate parts of your app manually if you're actually setting inputs directly. But you can run all of these at once and you might end up with an app that runs much better. That's pretty cool. This is kind of like what we're seeing in the React world with the compiler, but it's less like we have a new API that's how you're going to write React. It's more the compiler takes your React code and makes the actual output different. Different approaches with similar goals. Cool to see them making so much progress, though. Ooh, modernize your code via the language service. Angular's always been really deep on the dev tools side. Like they were first to TypeScript. They cared a lot about the language server and things like VS Code. It's not surprising that they're going all in on that with these huge changes. What's cool here is you can now click an input and convert it to a signal input. That's pretty cool. There's a one click to do that now. Very different syntax. So if input checked is false, convert input to a signal. Now it's read-only checked. Pretty cool. Read-only checked equals input false, using the input from Angular core instead of the directive. Entirely different syntax, but the potential performance here is massive. Cool to see that they have a code mod as well as editor tools to help you start migrating these things. Like imagine if when class components got moved to hooks, React gave us these tools to automatically start migrating things over to hooks. Angular has to because nobody wants to be in an old Angular code base in general, But if they're going to start making these changes, they need to make it as easy as possible so you don't end up with a split in your code base of the old way and the new way, because that's like the specific thing they want to avoid. So it's cool to see they care this much about these parts. They also introduced linked signals because people called out that they needed a solution for this common use case, because often in UIs, there's a need for mutable state that still tracks some higher level state. So if you have a selection UI that is a current selection state, which changes as the user makes selections, but it also needs to reset if the list of options gets changed. The linked signal primitive creates a writable signal which captures this type of dependency. So we have a signal with apple, banana, and fig, a linked signal which picks the first option. And now if we set our choice to fig and we call it, we see it's fig, but if we update the options so that they're actually peach and kiwi instead of these three options, if we still had fig, that's an invalid state because the options doesn't include fig. Hell, I've even had this problem with pick thing. I'll show you guys. Ignore Biden. If I select, actually, we won't ignore Biden. I'll select these. Now I'm going to click white shirt. I still have two selected because I'm not updating the selection based on what is or isn't visibly available, because I'd have to double the amount of code to do that. I will eventually, but I haven't yet. And as a result, you have these states where it says I have two things selected where I don't see anything on the screen that can be selected, and I can't even unselect them until I change the state. The only way to fix this is a lot of annoying update code, but now with linked signals, you can build these like derivative layers on top, these dependent chains to update as things go. They're derived values with the ability to set specific values. So I see that people like to name this computed values, but there's a difference because a computed value can't be set. If this computed value was just we take the first thing from options and then never let you change it, cool, computed value works. The difference here is once we have set this, you can now update it later on to not be the first value. But if the dependent value changes, it will reset with functionality. That's good. There are catches. There are absolutely catches. Like using this to do what I just showed properly requires you write a lot of code in this link signal update function, but it will at least work. There's a lot of potential here to build better UX as a result of these changes. That is quite exciting. It's also worth noting that Angular has its own computed signal, which is what we were just describing, where it only ever can be the value determined in this function. I can't override double count. The only way I change double count is by changing count because it's a derived value. It comes from the original. What a linked signal is actually a somewhat new concept where it is a derived signal that gets rederived whenever the state that it depends on changes, but can still get updated by the developer directly separately. I was going to ask about this. Like, do you get to see the options as well as what was previously selected? Good shit. It also has an advanced API, which allows for more complex logic, such as maintaining the user's choice as long as it exists in the new list of options, as I was just showing. Signals in Angular have focused on synchronous data, storing state in signals, computer values, inputs, queries, etc. In Angular 19, we're taking our first steps towards integrating signals with the asynchronous operations by introducing a new experimental resource API. It's an asynchronous dependency that participates in the signal graph. Is everything just becoming solid? Okay, so we get the user ID, which is an input, user service, which is an inject, and then user is a resource that uses the user ID, and it gets the user from user service. Is this like how hooks and context were trying to kill Redux, both indirectly and directly? Angular is now trying to kill RX. They still support it, as they show here, but yeah, very interesting. They have their effect API, which is kind of like use effect in React if you're familiar. And if you know how foot-gunny use effect is, then you might not be surprised to say that they are taking their time to make sure they get effects semantics right. We'll keep this API in developer preview to open the door for changes if we discover use cases we haven't taken into consideration yet. Yep. More work on Zoneless. Apparently everyone hates Zone.js. It's one of the biggest, heaviest parts of Angular, and everyone wants to move away from it. So it's cool to see progress there. I'm not going to pretend I care about material. I've talked about material theming too much this stream already. The Angular CDK has drag and drop in it. Interesting. It's weird seeing these things being built into the framework. I'm so used to React, which doesn't even have a concept of styling. This is actually a cool section. Evolving apps with unfolding best practices. It's one of our core values to evolve your apps together with Angular and the web platform. To ensure your apps are using the latest APIs as well as best practices, we shipped multiple improvements. I mentioned before, the default value of standalone has now been changed, so you're more likely to write components in the standalone fashion. Optional schematic transforms for your constructor-based dependency injection to inject functions. Yeah, all words. The generator to update to the new signal stuff is in there. New clustering stuff. The point being, they are very understanding of how big and ancient a lot of these old code bases were. And their goal isn't to just make a new Angular that makes everyone in the past feel bad. They are going out of their way to avoid another red wedding. And they're doing that by introducing best practices slowly, helping the community get used to them, and then setting them as a default a year or two later. That's a good strategy. That's cool to see. And when your framework prescribes different ways to do things like this, but the framework's realization of the right way changes over time, it's so important to balance this out. And it's honestly exciting to see them figuring it out. They have a huge thank you here at the bottom, which might not seem like that big of a deal, but for Angular, it is. The shift away from Angular as this separate team living in their ivory tower, building things and maintaining them for us to all figure out, towards being more community focused has been something I've even noticed externally as a React dev. We even had this problem in React for a bit. Now the React team is more accessible than ever. But yeah, Angular just felt like a black box. And now it doesn't. Now I have people on the Angular team reaching out to me. To be clear, none of them asked me to cover any of this stuff. I'm doing it because I found this to be a very interesting release. And I'm curious if you agree. Does this make you excited about Angular, or at the very least hyped to know the Angular devs aren't falling behind? Or is this making you disturbed as an Angular dev? Let me know in the comments. And until next time, peace nerds.